Yeah, I'm Suzanne Smith, State Rep, serving Plymouth, Hebron, and Holderness, and I thought I would come in today to share with you the latest news on the Northern Pass project. Last week I spent 6 hours down in Concord at the Site Evaluation Committee as they deliberated about whether to reconsider the Northern Pass application, which was requested by Eversource and the Northern Pass Company. And it was a really interesting day, and people, as we walked in, the room was full. Many people wearing orange. Every interveners were there from the Pemigewasset River Advisory Group, from wetlands scientists, Appalachian Mountain Club, Forest Society, and of course all the Eversource people were there, and some of the Chambers of Commerce people, and many reporters. So it was a really interesting day. The fact that it went for 6 hours says how deliberate the work that the Site Evaluation Committee does is. And they finally announced at the end of 6 hours that we are going to deny the project their permission to build the project. And Northern Pass had asked for reconsideration way back in February, immediately after a verbal denial came out from the SEC. And the SEC at that point had a public meeting and denied the project again, mostly because they hadn't even issued their written report. They said, we will decide whether to reconsider your application once we've done our written report and you have filed a better request for reconsideration. And so they issued a 200-page report explaining why they had denied the project. Eversource again applied, and that's why we had the 6-hour meeting. And if you're interested in watching paint dry, you would be interested in reading the transcripts from some of these Site Evaluation Committee meetings on the adjudicatory hearings. I read the 2.5 pages of the actual session when they voted unanimously to deny the project, back in February, and it took me most of a day to read it. It was hundreds and hundreds of pages of transcript. And the reason the project was denied was because one of the 4 criteria needed to pass a project, to approve a project, one of them, orderly development of the region. The project must the site and facility will not unduly interfere with the orderly development of the region. And that was the criteria that they failed the project on. And according to the statute, you must meet all 4 criteria to pass. So once that one was down the tubes, they said, why should we even review the next 2? And a lot of people said, if they had gone to the 3rd one, which was aesthetics, natural and cultural resources, they would have failed that one too, but they never even went through that. And it took, it was taking a day or 2 to do each one of those criteria before they were going to do the vote. But they voted after 2 because if 1 out of 4 is going to fail the project, why bother to continue? And in reading that transcript, what I learned is the major reason for the disruption of orderly development was the disruption to downtown Plymouth, because the roundabout was going to have to be closed for 3 months maybe, and traffic was going to be routed up like to Merrill Street and then up around the back of the university and then down, I don't know, south of near the Rite Aid, I think. I mean, I don't even know how that was going to work out, but it really would have disrupted town, and they said it would be probably from May until September. So it would cover graduation from the university and the high school, and then going back to school and students arriving back, and the businesses on Main Street would have been upstream without a paddle. It would have been really difficult to survive without any traffic driving through town. So it was really interesting to me that Plymouth was a main point, and that, obviously it was realistic. They're making that decision, but I think all the people who testified from the Plymouth area, the business owners who intervened, the town that intervened, all helped that decision because they provided so much information to the Site Evaluation Committee. and the other towns, the municipal towns, in municipalities, also Franconia was another one, and Littleton, where the project would go right through the middle of their downtowns. And then also the Department of Transportation had a problem with a lot of Eversource/Northern Pass's plans, because the Department of Transportation, when Eversource said, we're going to go down all these local roads, and DOT said, well, who's going to be responsible for organizing the traffic and regulating traffic flow and taking care of the roads when all this construction is going on? And Eversource's response was, well, the state will do it. And the state DOT just sat there and said, no, we won't. We do state roads. We do not do local roads. And then they said, well, then the Site Evaluation Committee could do it. Site Evaluation Committee said, we're an adjudicatory part of the government. We do not take care of who's going to do what with what roads. That's your job as the applicant. So it seemed pretty clear to those watching the proceedings from February until now that, and even for the last so many years, that that Northern Pass just did not do their homework, and they didn't listen to the many criticisms and the many complaints of what they were planning on doing. So right now, they've been formally denied, and the next step will be they will choose, most likely, they will appeal to the Supreme Court, the New Hampshire Supreme Court. And not being someone who's really skilled in what happens at the Supreme Court, it was interesting to note that the Supreme Court will not take any new evidence. They will be looking at the evidence that is in the site evaluation transcripts, which are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages. And then they will review whether the SEC did their job properly. One of the complaints that Northern Pass had coming in on Thursday was that the rules were not followed, and the rules regulating how they were supposed to operate, not the statute, but the administrative rules, were not put together well. They were vague. I was involved in the rulemaking process, and it went on for a year, and there were working groups of people of all stripes, and Eversource was very active in the rulemaking process. And so it wasn't that there were a bunch of anti-Northern Pass people in a room putting these rules together. There were governmental people, there were attorneys for Northern Pass, there were people who were opposed to the project, there were people for the project. So I think the process worked really well. And if they had come in with all their ducks lined up to begin with, they might have had a different outcome. If they had chosen to use the Energy Infrastructure Corridor going down 93 and bypassed Woodstock to Bristol, things might have worked out differently for them. But right now, that's where we stand.
So, are you willing to hazard any guesses? You said you didn't know much about the Supreme Court. Do we know anything about them? I'm just trying to speculate.
Yeah, well, one thing that's concerning to me is that the Supreme Court last week overruled the Public Utilities Commission, and regarding Eversource, another Eversource story, a few years ago, Eversource wanted to buy in and become part owners of the big gas pipeline that was supposed to go through the state, the Kinder Morgan one, and they wanted to be part of it because they wanted to have the ability to do electric generation from gas pipeline. And PUC said, because we have deregulation, Eversource had to divest themselves of all their generation facilities. In other words, the Merrimack Station and the dams and other things. They had to divest themselves from those. And because of the separation and the deregulation, I'm sorry, my phone is going off. Okay. It will stop in a second. And what the Supreme Court said is that the purpose wasn't of that legislation that was passed by the state had to do more with, had just as much to do with getting lower prices to consumers than it did from separating generation from transmission. Now, as someone who voted for that law, I would say that no, it was to make sure that your generation was separate from your transmission. So so the Supreme Court ruled that, that could affect one small part of Northern Pass, but just where they buy the power from Hydro-Quebec, or I'm not sure how that works, but it would just affect a small part of Northern Pass. But the fact that the Supreme Court is saying the legislature wasn't clear about what they said when we thought we were really clear, that makes me question what's going to happen. But if the Supreme Court, what they can say is they can say, we agree with the Site Evaluation Committee and this should not be passed on the basis of the evidence, or they will say, Site Evaluation Committee, you need to listen to the rest of their case.
So those are the two options.
Yeah, they can't come back and say they can shut it. They can agree with the Site Evaluation Committee, or they can disagree, which means, yeah,
Wow.
yeah.
But that doesn't mean
it's ever going to pass.
And so if it goes back to the Site Evaluation Committee, they redeliberate. They say there's all these other things that are wrong, and then it would go. And we still want to shut it down, and then it would go back up to the Supreme Court again?
It depends when they run out of money or their shareholders say, hey, why are we doing this?
By now.
I heard an estimate on New Hampshire Public Radio on the Friday News Roundup. The rough estimate is they've spent $100 million so far. So at some point the shareholders, I would think, are going to question the validity of the project. Their primary goal in the beginning was to use their own right-of-ways or rights-of-way. So they would not have to pay lease payments to whoever owned the property. The Granite State Power Link wanted to use the line that comes down from Hydro-Quebec and enters New Hampshire at the Monroe Dam and then goes down through my town, through Hebron and Hill and Bristol and downward. And they didn't, and I asked Northern Pass at many of the public meetings, why haven't you considered using the lines that are already there? And they didn't have an answer. And it would be because they would have to pay National Grid a lease fee to use their power lines.
Right.
And if they use the energy infrastructure corridor down the highway, they will have to pay the state a lease agreement.
Right.
So
it is money.
And it's interesting, but all the money they have spent to buy acres and acres of property at way above market price up in Coos County, so that they would own the land and can build the towers on that property, and all the money they've spent fighting the project, fighting the opposition for this long makes you question, why didn't they just bite the bullet to begin with and use the energy infrastructure corridors? Interestingly enough, Liberty Utilities, which is a natural gas company, or has a natural gas part of their company, they have applied to use the energy infrastructure corridor going along Route 101 from the seacoast to Manchester. And I spoke with one of their representatives when they first were going to announce it. And he said, we're going to use one of your corridors, because I was the sponsor of the bill. And I said, I heard. And he said, the company was a little, why are we going to do that? Why are we going to pay the state to use this corridor? And he said, you'll thank me because of all the local opposition that you will get from people not wanting it in their backyards. And this way it's along a highway, it's already disturbed property. So they've had their first public meetings. I have no idea what's going to happen with that project, but that's a company who's forward thinking as far as, we have this project, this corridor approved. We might as well just use it instead of fighting everybody and his brother all the way up and down the line.
Maybe they did the math and they figured out they're going to come out ahead. If
I think so.
Use the
I think they did.
Even though it might not be their first choice.
Right.
Interesting.
Yeah. So the meeting last Thursday, some of the things that Northern Pass complained about, one of the things was they wanted two of the two public members to recuse themselves because they were prejudiced. They were prejudicial. They knew they didn't want the project. And I never got that impression watching them at at the hearings that I'd been to and the deliberations I had been to. And everything that the site evaluation said last week was to provide, it was useful and it was important to be really clear about why they weren't going to recuse themselves. Because everything they say in that room is public. And so you don't always say the exact right wording of something because you're up there without a rehearsal and you're just answering questions and having a discussion, but it's all public. So they pretty much refused to recuse themselves and explained why. But all of the deliberations that they did last week, they said this should give the Supreme Court more information. So they knew the Supreme Court was the next step. Also, if the project had been approved by some slim chance 6 months ago, it still would have gone to the Supreme Court, but it would have been the opposition taking it to the Supreme Court.
Somebody was going to go to the Supreme Court one way or the other.
Right. So interesting.
It is. So to recap, going to the Supreme Court, two things are going to happen.
Eversource is not yet.
Done.
Eversource is not yet, put in their papers for the Supreme Court, but we assume that is what is going to happen. But the Site Evaluation Committee denied it and and then refused to reconsider it, and gave really good reasons why they would not reconsider it.
And Massachusetts also denied it.
Correct. That brings up two more things. So yeah, Massachusetts had chosen Northern Pass for their renewable portfolio big ticket item that was going to provide, a lot of power to Massachusetts from hydro. And when Northern Pass was denied by the Site Evaluation Committee initially, they gave Northern Pass a month to come, to reapply or do whatever they needed to do, and nothing came of it. And so therefore they turned down Northern Pass and they went to a company from a project that's bringing hydro down from Quebec through Maine. But that project has not really had any of its hearings or formal processes either. Whereas there's another project in Vermont which has been approved everywhere, but they were not accepted by Massachusetts either. And there is another group, I think I wrote this down, that is, where did I write it down? That is is battling the federal government because they think that the federal government should not have given permission for the project, for Northern Pass to go through the White Mountains or to cross the border. And they had 2 or 3 reasons why that they thought this was a really bad idea. And so that's another thing that's going on the federal level.
Why are these projects, maybe this is one example of a number of them getting okays?
Yeah, but it was the destruction of the White Mountain National Forest and the loss of the aesthetic value, but also trying to give all the power and all the money to these large projects that aren't local when you have local solar. It's a solar company from New York that's filed the motion. Against the U.S. Forest Service's approval of Northern Pass to cross the border from Canada and go through the White Mountains. Because the U.S. Forest Service had to give permission.
Yeah.
And the solar company said this is, it's trying to put all those local, smaller businesses out of business.
Because the solar businesses are generally smaller.
Right.
Obviously, they're not a giant
like
Hydro-Quebec.
Right.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and that's just in the last week or two also.
So maybe all the luck to them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then a final, well, this has nothing to do with Northern Past. So do you have any more Northern Past questions?
Not right now.
It's like my mind starts spinning. But the House and Senate both passed many bills related to energy this year, and one of them would help our timber industry and our biomass companies, of which we have one in Bridgewater, the one in Alexandria went out of business. There's Wheelabrator, which turns waste into energy down in Pennacook. And the House and Senate passed these bills with a pretty good margin, and the governor's getting a lot of pressure to veto them. And there was a op-ed in the Concord Monitor today from Jeb Bradley, Senator Bradley, and Representative Herb Richardson from up in Lancaster, both asking the governor and explaining to people why it's important that this legislation passes into law. So that's another energy thing that's happening, or that happened in the legislature and now is sitting at the governor's desk waiting for him to sign it. So I'm hoping he signs it.
What is it exactly that they...
And the governor is thinking he will veto it because the big businesses down in the southern part of the state don't like that we're giving any kind of a subsidy or a better deal to small hydro and biomass. And I had a friend who used to own the micro hydro in Campton, right on the Mad River there, and he was getting so little from Eversource Public Service in New Hampshire for the energy he was producing that he couldn't even afford to pay insurance on the hydro, let alone repair the turbines if something went wrong with them. And when net metering came in, it really helped ease that burden so that at least the hydro was breaking even. And since then, things have changed again, and the wholesale market is going down. And so that was included in this biomass bill because the wood chip prices are way down now for a number of reasons. I'm not sure exactly all of them, but so that was the reason to give them a 2-year leeway to kind of figure out what they were going to do so that they could stay in business and small hydro can stay in business, because local energy is probably second best to energy efficiency, which is the energy we don't use but save money because we don't use it, whereas and then the local renewable resources we have here in New Hampshire, like all our rivers and streams and our softwood that goes into chips.
Is that Campton Dam still in existence? Still working?
Yeah,
Oh.
my friend sold it to someone who was interested in it, and the only reason he was able to sell it is because of net metering, group net metering.
So it barely breaks even.
Yeah, now it breaks even, and so it's for someone who's interested in sustainable local energy, it's a good...
Right, I mean, I would think we'd want to promote that.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
again, you're fighting.
There used to be many more of them, but there's one in Rochester, a couple in Rochester, there's one in Bristol on the Newfound River, Campton, Bath, there's a few. Well, the legislative season is finished for the year. We finished early this year because the Senate chambers are being totally renovated, repaired, and so they needed everyone out of that area, so senators couldn't meet, so therefore we all finished up early, which was great. And this year is the bicentennial, or this next year, during the next years, we're celebrating the bicentennial. There have already been events, but at 200 years of the State House being
In operation.
House being operated. We're the oldest operating State House in the country, where it's been in the same building for so many years. Yeah.
Oh, neat. So
Yeah.
that's going on. Well,
The work is going on now, because I was down Bridgewater Hebron, children, 4th graders came to visit, and they weren't allowed to go into the Senate chambers.
Wow.
Usually,
So they were very upset.
no, but they hung out with me in the house in Reps Hall, so that was fun.